So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us this evening. You're welcome whether members of Leicester's Literary and Philosophical Society or as visitors. This evening we have the joint lecture with the Natural History section of the Lit and Phil. We welcome our speaker, John Clarkson, of the Leicester and Rutland Wildlife Trust, who responded to our request at short notice. So thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
I will introduce him in a moment, but first there are some notices. Just heard this evening that some of you weren't able to get on to view the Peach lecture, but the good news is that it is on YouTube. John Fothergill's just put it in the chat, the link, but if you go onto YouTube and put in Peach lecture, you'll get straight to it. And it's well worth listening to the lecturer. In 2 weeks' time, on Monday, the 22nd of March, there is the inaugural F.L. Attenborough lecture, which is named, with the permission of the family, after Frederick Attenborough, the principal of Leicester University College and president of this society from 1939 to 1946. His grandson, the Honourable Michael Attenborough, will lecture on "Do the Arts Have Any Role in Education?" There is a change of plan for Monday the 26th of April, when the original programme assumed we might be back in the museum's Victorian Gallery listening to the Bardi wind soloists after the annual meeting. Instead, we will postpone the music and the meeting to the opening of the autumn season on the 4th of October, with the hope that we will be back in the museum. On the 26th of April instead, we will have an extra lecture, and it will be given by Professor Claire Wilsden of the University of Glasgow, who is with us this evening. Her subject is Roses, Leeks and Water Lilies, Impressionist Painters in the Garden. And I think we shall end our season on a high note. The geology section have a lecture on the 10th of March at 7:30 p.m. given by Zoe Milton of Plymouth University on recent and historical earthquakes. Now, on to this evening. On behalf of the Lit and Phil, I'd like to welcome John Clarkson, who is the head of conservation of the Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust. Throughout his career, John has been involved with many aspects of ecology and nature conservation in Britain and abroad. His projects have ranged from reintroducing large blue butterflies at a Somerset Nature Reserve to leading rapid biodiversity assessment expeditions to Malaysia and Patagonia, and also being a lecturer at Nottingham Trent University. Now he leads a team managing the 35 Wildlife Trust reserves in Leicestershire and Rutland. After last week's Peach lecture by Craig Bennett, the CEO of the Wildlife Trust, where he called for individual and local action, it is most appropriate to hear about action in Leicestershire and Rutland. I'm pleased to invite John Clarkson to speak on the Nature Recovery Network.
Bridget, thank you very, very much for that. A fantastic opportunity to, as you say, follow on from what Craig said last week. I'm honoured to be in front of an esteemed audience for this evening. I will go straight into my talk and see if I can get this going. And it's really timely that we have this opportunity to explore nature recovery networks. If I can here we go. Hopefully everybody can see the screen, so that's great. So yes, so what I'm working for the Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about nature recovery networks as they apply across England in particular, and then drill down into a little bit of detail about what we aim to do, rather than necessarily what we're currently doing, with a little bit of that as we go along, in terms of delivering this at a local level. So I'm actually going to cover 3 different aspects, and the really brilliant part of this is that this is in a sense, this is setting the scene for the future, hopefully a brand new future for wildlife in all of England, Leicestershire and Rutland too. So I'll be touching on the Nature Recovery Network, which is a project, if you like, which is a national one. So the idea here is that we create a national nature recovery network, which Craig was touching on last week, and that comes out of it actually comes out of the 25-year environment plan, which the government has to abide by. Came out quite a few years ago now. And then I'll be touching on in local detail the local nature recovery strategy, which, as its name suggests, is a local version of that. And some of you may well you may well remember that as a result of the Rio Convention, the Rio Earth Summit, there was a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of passion and motivation based around what we called biodiversity action plans. So from kind of 1981 onwards, there were lots and lots of action in that area, and that's kind of disappeared a wee bit, and I'm hoping that the local nature recovery strategy will reinvigorate conservation action at all sorts of levels. And then I'm going to drill down into a little bit of detail of a project called Biodiversity Opportunity Mapping, because this, from an ecological perspective, is a really, really interesting, really exciting element to all of this. So as you those of you who joined Craig's lecture last week, you might remember, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, some of the reasons why we need a nature recovery. And I don't know how many of you are avid fans of the Groniad or the Guardian, whatever you want to call it. But over the weekend, so actually on Wednesday, there was yet another article highlighting the ecological problem as we have it at the moment. So this one was an article by Patrick Barkham highlighting the state of Britain's moths, the larger moths in particular, and the study showing that there's been a decline by 1/3 in the number of moths over the last 50 years. So when you add all of that together, with all of the other stories that are kicking around, it must surely be incontrovertible that nature is in trouble, and the rate of decline is so marked that we must do something really, really quickly. The time for talk is over. We probably only have, as Craig was saying, 10 years to turn this ship around and do something positive and make a change and make a difference. And you might remember from Craig's talk that on the picture on the right hand side, which is a map of intactness within the United Kingdom. And obviously we can have some arguments about whether that really matters. Of course, if we were to go all the way back to the last ice age and think about the distribution of, well, actually ice across the top of the United Kingdom, followed by tundra and then woodlands. It's actually hard to define what we mean by a natural environment now. And it's possibly irrelevant in many respects. We need to be looking forwards to identifying spaces for people and wildlife in the coming years, especially as a result of climate change. But nonetheless, there's a clear indication there that the impacts, let's think of it in terms of impacts of human beings, we have a landscape which is severely impacted by human beings and their activity across Great Britain. So there are lots of species out there which are in trouble. And there are lots of species that aren't going to make it to 2030, even in the United Kingdom. And I'm fond of talking about the fact that, for example, there's a good sense that lapwing won't exist outside of protected sites by 2030. My partner and I, we were listening to song thrushes this morning, and actually this evening the song thrush was missing. And kind of wondering what future song thrushes have as a result of climate change. And I don't know how many of you have been to Melton Mowbray, or indeed been looking at the other starling murmurations that are in the landscape. And we mustn't forget that starlings have suffered something like there's a 68% decline in the last decade or so. So, we can't take these things for granted. It's too easy to do so. So we need to create a nature recovery network, an opportunity for nature to recover. And I'm just going to put some terminology in front of you. Many of you, hopefully all of you, will be familiar with these words, but I don't want to take them for granted because they're important, and they underpin a lot of the thinking that we do within the Wildlife Trust, and a lot of thinking that I would implore everybody to think about when you're looking at the robin in the garden. Actually, last night we made a fantastic discovery. We dug a new pond 2 weeks ago, and last night we found a smooth newt in it already, which was fantastic. So the first thing is something which Craig referred to, which is the Lawton report, which came out 10 years ago. Actually, there was a letter written by Sir John Lawton just a month or two ago as the 10th anniversary. He wrote that letter with colleagues to say, actually, we haven't really done enough in the 10 years since the issuing of the report. And the key mantra from that report was that we need more sites, we need bigger sites, we need better managed sites, better quality habitats, and we need them to be connected. And there's a reason for the picture that you can see to the right. And I'll leave you to kind of guess where that might be. It should be pretty obvious, really. But hopefully within that picture, you get a sense of how you might create a network, figuratively speaking, within the wider countryside. Which is about creating more patches, bigger patches, making them better and more connected. And this keyword habitat patch, because in terms of recreating a landscape that's fit for wildlife, we need to look at habitats as patches. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the kind of island biogeography as a concept, that Edward Wilson and colleagues captured this notion that, and in fact, their work was based on, along with Jared Diamond and Lordy, the name escapes me of the other person, which is really bad, MacArthur. They actually fumigated mangrove islands and removed all of the beetles from those mangrove patches, and it enabled them to kind of come up with this idea of looking at small islands and the number of species that an island can support. And that was in the kind of early to late 60s, middle 1960s. And since then, we've begun to realize that in a terrestrial landscape, we should look at habitats as islands too, as patches within a sea of maybe habitat that is unfavorable to the species that exist within those patches. So next time you drive around, have a look at the different habitats and look at them as being islands within a landscape. And this is where we move into the ecology, because obviously one of the critical things here is species need to move move across their landscape, rather, not necessarily from patch to patch. They need to move across their landscape if they are motile. If they're not, then they don't. We've obviously got a whole raft of plants and other organisms that don't necessarily move. But a degree of movement is important for sharing of the genetic material. So even if they are stationary, then there's a mechanism by which they in effect need to move across the landscape. And that's the point of dispersal, whether it's the dispersal of the gametes or the zygote, the whole body. So there's a critical element that in the landscape, We all enjoy, don't we, fantastic television programs showing us the herd of wildebeest migrating across the African plains, and elephants and all the sorts of other organisms which are dispersing. One of the critical things that we've done in the United Kingdom is to pretty much prevent a lot of natural dispersal. So in our nature recovery network, we need to re-enable the kind of dispersal patterns that would have naturally been occurring. And one of the things we can do is to do that through the creation of corridors. To basically just, you can see some corridor, the grassy corridor in the picture there. And one of the critical things we have to remember, and there's kind of giving away an answer here, is that a corridor to one is a barrier to another. So imagine that you're a newt, maybe a frog or a toad. Well, in fact, imagine you're a fish in the pond on the left-hand side. It's very difficult for you to get to the right-hand side because the grassland corridor is a barrier to you. So once we start to delve into the ecology of the landscape, it actually gets very, very complex, and it provides us with all sorts of challenges. And this is where we come on to terms like buffers and permeability, that we need to buffer the patches, the habitat patches, from the impacts of the landscape around them. So of course, if you've got a woodland, we need to buffer the woodland from the impacts of housing estates, where people tend to go and fly tip or just simply wander into the woodland. There are things called edge effects. So buffering is a really important aspect, as is something called permeability. And we're increasingly looking at the landscape in terms of permeability. So how easy is it for an organism to move through that landscape? And that's a really, really important aspect for us. It's not something that's universal as a problem, because of course, if you've got wings, it really doesn't really make much difference. You just simply fly over the problem in front of you. If you're dispersed by wind, it's not a problem as long as the winds are there. But permeability for a lot of species is a real challenge. But the most important thing I want to put in front of you as a concept that we need to think about in terms of creating a nature recovery network is this term resilience. Because of course, what we are faced with is an uncertain future, one that's challenged by climate change. And of course, we don't know. I mean, we've got a good idea that climate change, we're heading to all sorts of temperature changes, and kind of possibly 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2050, at best, if we're lucky. But what we've obviously seen in the last few years is tremendous cold weather just in the last month or so, haven't we? Lots of rain, lots of snow, really, really changeable weather, and the system needs to be resilient and capable of absorbing those changes and those challenges. So we need to create within the system a sense of resilience, just like with your human body. When you're weakened, your resilience to diseases declines, and ill health and things like that. And we need to do that with the natural environment. We need to create a natural environment that's capable of being resilient to the pressures that we place upon it. So a nature recovery network seems very simple. You just create new patches, you create corridors that link those patches, you improve the habitat, Bob's your uncle. But actually, once we start to delve into the detail, it's much, much, much more complex than that, as you might expect. So I'm just going to ask you this is something I'll come back to later on, but I'm going to ask you to pop in chat, if you like, some ideas about how far you think species like the dormouse might disperse across the wider countryside. How far you think a great crested newt might disperse. Pop these in chat, or just wait and see what we come up with as answers later on. How far might crickets and grasshoppers disperse? Spiders, obviously. There are different dispersal mechanisms that we need to think about when we're thinking about creating a nature recovery network. Fungi, wood anemones, and I've deliberately put in bearded stonewort just in case anybody saw the news item about bearded stonewort, which kind of comes back to Ray's point about was it a caddisfly? I think, I can't remember, that you mentioned, Ray. So there's some really important challenges here about key species and how far they can disperse and whether or not we need to help them. The large blue butterfly in the bottom right-hand corner, as Bridget was saying, I was involved in a reintroduction program. It's a notoriously poor disperser. Actually, probably only flies about 30 to somewhere between 30 and 300 meters before it pegs it. Really is dependent. Actually, the dispersal of the large blue butterfly is almost dependent upon trains in the United Kingdom, because they've now moved down to railway cuttings, and it's the wind, the rush taken by the train, which sucks them along and helps them move along the landscape. So they're piggybacking in that respect. And obviously I've talked about the different mechanisms of dispersal, and these are all important, some of which we can change and some of which we can't. And so in creating a nature recovery network, we need to have cognizance of all of those. And the last one, time, is really important too. There was a fantastic discovery in Norfolk 6 months ago, where there was somebody was excavating some ponds that had lain derelict. In fact, I think they disappeared 60 years previously. They might have been bomb craters or something. I can't remember specifically. You have to forgive me. It's just off the kind of just something I just remembered in minutes. In terms of restoring, if you like, those ponds, a whole raft of species which had not been seen for a long time, for 60 years, appeared out of the seed bank. So time itself is also an important disperser, if you like, in that kind of context. Just so as you've got an idea, let's have a look at one of these in particular, the wood anemone. Well, the wood anemone has a very heavy seed. It's pretty much dispersed by ants. So its dispersal power is probably something like 6 millimeters a year, to give you an idea of how, kind of how quickly it can move through the landscape. The bearded stonewort was discovered in, a second population was discovered in northern England. And the suggestion in the newspaper or in the BBC website, wherever it was that it was transported on the feet of a duck. So, and by several hundred miles. So we've got a variety of forms of dispersal. So the Nature Recovery Network with capital letters, and there's an important distinction here. And you guys, you've got an opportunity to get engaged in all of these in all sorts of different ways. This is a government commitment as part of the 25-year plan, as I mentioned before, to create a national network of wildlife-rich places. And you might have come across this commitment from Boris Johnson to 30% of the landscape being protected for wildlife. And this Nature Recovery Network will be an integral part of that 30%. So by 2042, 75% of our protected sites should be restored to favourable condition. And at the moment, I think Craig said, didn't he, last week, that maybe less than half are in favourable condition. So there's a big challenge there. And these are triple SIs, local nature reserves, SPAs, the old European important sites. One would think that our nationally important sites would all be in favourable condition, but less than half, maybe less than half currently are. So we need to get 3/4 of them into good condition. And that's the shocking thing. To create or restore 500,000 hectares of additional habitat, okay, that's a huge amount, additional habitat, all the habitat that we've lost. We need to recover threatened species, and we need to help increase woodland cover. These are the ideas, these are the benefits of a nature recovery network. So all by 2042. This is a big, tall order in a national programme to create a recovery network in a nationwide context. And they'll be doing it, the idea is to do it also by providing benefits in terms of flood management, carbon capture, ecosystem service like pollination, and also recreation. So the idea here is that people can enjoy wildlife, because obviously a lot of people suffer from what we call nature deficit disorder in one sense. So there's an aspect here that we kind of need to be alert to. Yeah, important question there about trees rather than meadows, I guess, in terms of carbon capture. And there's an important aspect there. Actually, the carbon, the greatest source of carbon is within the soils rather than necessarily within the trees. In many areas, whether it's peat or indeed the substrates of the ponds. So there's a big issue there about the whys and wherefores of trees, the right trees in the right place. And this is possibly, some of the areas where you guys might get engaged too. So the way in which the government aims to achieve this is by integrating with funding streams, such as there's a major fund called Nature for Climate. At the moment, the government is issuing its second Green Recovery Challenge Fund, something like £40 million, I think, for green projects. And then there's the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which Craig referred to in terms of farming, and whether we paying for public goods like clean air, clean water. And there'll be 10 landscape recovery projects based around that. And a little bit of politics here, but actually this is really important. There's a Nature Recovery Network Delivery Partnership, and I'm going to touch on that because I'm really interested in what I call network architecture in terms of stakeholders. And there's a really important role that we can all play here too, not just in terms of delivering wildlife on the ground, but in terms of lobbying and working with the key partners in this. And I'll touch on that in a wee while. And then I mentioned the local nature recovery strategy. So just to come on to this management group, the Nature Recovery Network Partnership, there is a national partnership management group, which has not just the usual suspects, Natural England, DEFRA and the Environment Agency, but other government departments too. Possibly for the first time, we're getting the opportunity to engage with the likes of the Ministry of Justice, and more fully with the Department of Business and the Department of Transport, to get them to engage and realise the importance of delivering nature at a national level and their duty on that. So we have an opportunity to lobby those different departments to deliver. Think about, actually, as an example, 50% of lowland calcareous grassland, one of the most threatened habitats, 50% of the national resource is on Ministry of Defence land at Salisbury Plain. And if the Ministry of Defence did not manage that land, it's effectively been saved since the Second World War, simply by being Salisbury Plain. Without it, we would have lost, I don't know, maybe 45% of what we currently have. So there's an example of the importance of the Ministry of Defence. So it's not just the government departments, but it's also, we have sectoral representatives on this national body. So some really interesting stuff in terms of health agencies, the Academy for Social Prescription, businesses, but also development like the House Builders Federation, and finance. And if with your pensions, with looking at housing schemes, there's an opportunity to lobby these people and persuade them and help them understand why they've got a role in terms of delivering a nature recovery network. And I don't know how many of you saw some really interesting stuff about persimmon as an example, really exciting stuff about their perception on their environmental responsibility. So we're actually seeing that wildlife recovery is not just about the usual suspects. We can do more to encourage these guys to actually feel good about what they do, because obviously everybody can do a little bit for wildlife, and I'm especially interested in the dynamics within this kind of partnership. So that's an important background there in terms of the nature recovery. What I'm going to do now is just give you a quick overview of how the nature recovery network might be created, in terms of what it actually means in a wildlife perspective. So the principles are, and there's still work going on here. This is a new concept. It's still being developed. The principles are obviously the Norton principle. We need to identify and protect those core sites, the triple SIs, and the sites of European importance. And we need to enhance those protected areas. We need then to identify existing patches of what we call priority habitats, those most important habitats in the wider countryside, which we need to protect and enhance. So the term priority habitats is important. We then need to look at what are the other habitats, when you add them together, create a bigger mosaic across which lots of species occur. So, think about brown hares as an example. They don't just box in the grasslands in March. They're an edge species that lives in woodland, and the woodland edge in particular. They love a landscape which is woodland edge and grassland and hedgerow. And so you need this mosaic of bigger patches of habitat and little bits of corridor, and it's the same with hedgehogs too, as an example. So we need to identify this bigger mosaic, and then we need to identify areas with high concentrations of species. And indeed, this is a nature recovery network for people, so we need to throw in green spaces. We then need to identify places for ecosystem services, such as flood control and pollination and all that sort of stuff. And we need to identify areas for potential habitat recreation. And we need to do this pretty quickly. We need to have this fixed by 2042. And that's a tall order when you think about it. And I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the kind of ways in which this is being mapped out at the moment. So Natural England have done a lot of work on mapping the priority habitats. And here's a map of England showing all of the combined priority habitats as they see it. And I apologize for the scale, it's tiny. But the point here is what you can see: national aggregations, big patches that they consider to be really, really important in a national context. And remember, this is a national recovery network that they're looking at. So they're looking at, that Pennine Spine as an example, and the Southwest and in kind of the New Forest landscape as major aggregations of really, really important habitats. And if you're really into this sort of thing, you can begin to see some of the influences of geology, thinking about, kind of the limestones and chalks and, all those sorts of influences there. If we look at it at a Leicestershire level, I apologise for the tiny scale, it doesn't really matter. What you've got is, you've got Euston Woods in the bottom right-hand corner, just out towards Rutland Water, and then towards the middle left there, you've got Bradgate Park, and you're moving up to Ashby de la Zouche, but these are triple SIs. Okay, Charnwood Lodge is up there towards the north, the top left-hand corner. These are the triple SIs, okay? Remember, this is the bedrock, and these need to be enhanced in their quality. And we need to connect them to enable species to move between them. So the next stage is, and I apologise, this is quite faint, as Craig indicated, we then need to identify where the existing patches of habitat are. Now, the really important thing is, notice how much white there is. Okay, and I apologize, it's not necessarily as clear as it could be, but we're talking patches of habitat in a sea, and we need to connect those patches, and we need to make more of them as part of this national network. And the next stage then is to identify these aggregations. So the light brown just indicates where these important aggregations are, so that we can begin to think, well, where do we connect and where do we rebuild and where do we make and identify and protect these most important habitats? And this will be part of the National Recovery Network. Okay, so the importance here is not just the local level, but it's the national level. So think here about some of the species, the talk last week about dormice and where dormice could be, thinking about the woodlands and the different landscapes where they would most appropriately be. And think about other species too, that might be either in the existing landscape or could be. Remember, Charnwood is a landscape which used to have hen harriers. So we're talking hundreds of hectares, if not thousands of hectares of heathland 200 years ago. So it's a very different landscape. So the fundamental principle is that it needs to be big enough to be ecologically functional. It needs to be heterogeneous, so mixed habitats. It needs to be messy, not tidy, ecologically complex, and it needs to be dynamic. So then we know we need floods, we need fire, we need wind blow, we need change, we need big herbivores turning it all over. And we need a landscape where people have a sense of place, because we are a part of nature. And those are the fundamental principles of the Nature Recovery Network at a national level. And there's lots of work going on at the moment, which I'll touch on. I've touched on the national stuff and I'll touch on the local stuff too. So within that National Nature Recovery Network and the principles there, as I said, as part of the Environment Bill, we have a responsibility for creating a local nature recovery strategy. It's actually likely to be led by local planning authorities, and that will come as a part of the Environment Bill when the Environment Bill is passed, hopefully, in the autumn. And it'll be a series of local versions delivering the National Nature Recovery Network, and we'll need to write a statement of biodiversity priorities, a local biodiversity action plan, if you like. And it's currently being trialled in 5 areas, and I've just given you an indication of one there, which is Cumbria. And again, if you're really interested in this sort of thing, each of these has a bit of a website. You can have a look at what they're doing. And we're avidly watching, you know, how these 5 pilots are building their local nature recovery strategy as part of the National Nature Recovery Network. So how do we make it happen at a local level? Well, we do it in the same way. We're going to do it in the same way, but different, obviously, locally relevant. And again, the picture has relevance. I'll leave you to guess which of our nature reserves this is taken from, and the landscape that it's looking over. And you know, the point here is that we need to rebuild this landscape, the connections, and improving the habitats. And we can only do that through partnerships, partnerships with landowners and farmers and house building agencies and all that sort of thing. And we need to do some mapping, and then we need to deliver it. So it's the mapping that I want to touch on this evening, because I find this as an ecologist really, really exciting. Now, what I'm going to touch on is this aspect called biodiversity opportunity mapping. And do the Environment Agency, does the Environment Act give funds to local authorities to do the work? In part, it will do, but that's one of the challenges that's currently being considered, and there'll be further detail on that in the future. As I say, there are some nuances within the Environment Act that come out of that. Now, what you can see in front of me is actually a biodiversity opportunity map of the area where I live, which is Fiskerton, just outside of Newark. And Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust have been doing some cracking work on just literally taking maps, identifying habitats, and you can see the different colours there, and then working with local experts to identify where are places where they can recreate and connect existing and new habitats. And literally what they do is, you know, just put a map on the table with crayons, and everybody goes, yeah, you know what, Mr. Jones owns this field. He's quite a good person, you know, kind of has the right ideas. He's ready to turn it into a wildflower meadow. Mrs. Brooks, she owns a woodland, could do with a little bit of improvement, but she's ready to kind of help improve that woodland. And that's how they literally go about it. And on Wednesday, the Nottinghamshire Biodiversity Action Group have got their annual review as a public event to kind of just explore what they've been doing and how far they've got with this biodiversity opportunity mapping. And I'm just going to touch on this in an ecological way in a bit more detail now, because again, it's not as easy as it might seem. It would be so easy, wouldn't it, if we literally just pinned down a field and said, you know what, that's the field where we need to put in a meadow, or turn it into woodland or anything like that. And so this simple starting point would be to identify land parcels adjacent to existing habitats. And the picture I showed you previously was looking out from Lawn Parkwood across to Lawn Bigwood and Euston Wood. Okay, and that's where, to give you the sense of landscape. And obviously what we would try to do would be to connect all of those patches together. But remember, dispersal is a real challenge. And obviously there's also the fact that people live and work in the surrounding landscape. So we can't just go out and plant trees everywhere. We can't just go out and create meadows. We need to work with the people who own that land, who work with that land, to help them, you know, kind of turn it into something appropriate and ecologically appropriate too. Now, there's a lot of words on this slide, and I don't intend to go through them all, but the point is, this is about much more than simple things like species numbers, as Craig was saying. It's about abundance, it's about species diversity, it's about the connectedness of populations, it's about the intactness of habitats and the size of the patches and the integrity of food webs. If you can't find your prey, it doesn't matter how you introduce your predators. You know, bats, for example, they need what we call a core sustenance zone of 3 kilometers around their roost if the females are to raise their young. then they need to be able to find food within a big area. Barn owls, they need their food within 500 meters of their nest space within a few weeks. So there's a whole raft of different things that we've got to fix here, not just simply creating habitats. The populations have got to be big enough. And a big issue, which Craig didn't touch upon because he didn't have time, is that there's a problem with genetic integrity in a lot of species. You might remember the red kite, as an example, was stuck in Wales in small numbers because of its very, very low genetic diversity. And it was only by reintroducing a wider genetic spectrum from Germany and Sweden and Spain, I think, that actually transformed the health of the red kite as a population. And we see that, we begin to see that with other species too. So the question is, how might species move and use this kind of landscape? Now, remember what I talked about, corridors and permeability. Some of those habitats are permeable and some of them are impermeable, depending on your perspective. Some of them are barriers to you. Some of them are corridors to you. Some of them, you just simply fly over and it makes no difference. But if we're to create a landscape where species can interact, where predator-prey dynamics can operate normally, where young can separate from their parents, where you can breed in one location and winter in another, we need to understand how species move and how they utilize that landscape. And it's much, much more complex than would easily at first thinking happen. And there was mention about pigs, earlier on, about kind of managing habitats and how they might use them. Now, again, lots of detail. Don't expect to go through all of this sort of stuff, but some of the detail here gives an indication of how far some species might move. So lesser spotted woodpecker, maybe up to 3 kilometers. Chaffinches, maybe 150 meters. Okay, so you're looking at dispersal distances maybe between 50 meters and 3 kilometers in terms of their kind of core sustenance zones. Mammals, well, the dormouse actually, it's a species we consider to be only of a woodland, but if you put them in the middle of a field, then Buchner and Euschytus have shown that they will move maybe half a kilometer, maybe a kilometer. Across open fields, as an example. Maybe if they have to rather than want to, but they can move that sort of distance. Great crested newts, maybe a kilometre, across the landscape, even through the fields of wheat, although they find it very, very difficult. And so you've got, kind of different distances, some long distances and some very, very short. And that's the really, really important thing here. We need to recognise that not every species move. John, I don't know the answer to that in terms of are they over a course of a year or the life of an animal. I think it's a mixture of things here. It's about kind of their core sustenance zones during breeding season, as well as over kind of a period of their lifespan. As I say, it's a mixture of dispersal distances, but it's the point here to get an understanding that, things are restricted, and they're restricted by something called permeability. So here we have a woodland, and there are 3 types of permeability surrounding it. Where it's high permeability, the species can move a long distance. Where it's low permeability, so imagine that low permeability, for example, could be a town. A species might not be able to move through that town, so it can't move very far. And we need to recognize that. And it impacts some species and it doesn't others. And we need to think about this when we're thinking about, as I mentioned, brown hares, hedgehogs, great crested newts, dormice, in terms of creating a nature recovery network. We need to recognize that these species need to move in some way, shape or form, but they might find it very, very difficult. Now, what we'll be doing, we're in Leicestershire and Rutland, we're just on the journey now. We're just beginning to get together a partnership to look at how we map and how we create a model to determine where we rebuild the landscape. And there are a variety of computer models that we can use, or mechanical models. I'm not going to go through them in any detail, but the point here is you can see that they're built around things like an understanding of species movement and habitat permeability, something called least cost path, which I'm going to put in front of you as a concept, because this I find ecologically really interesting. and probability modeling and all that sort of stuff, So it's very, very complex, and there are lots of people making lots of money out of this, and lots of ecologists getting really taxed by it, and it's lots of really exciting stuff. But I want to put in front of you this concept of least cost path. I'm not saying that it's the only thing to think about, but do you remember the pictures I showed you of Rutland Water and the woodland landscape? And there's a lot of thinking that species, actually, many species abide by this, what we call least cost path approach to moving through the landscape, that they will try to get as far as they can with the least possible cost. Those costs can be things like predation risk. You don't go into a risky environment, you move around the risky environment. So on the left-hand side, this particular organism can only move 2 paces of 2 squares, because they are both very, very high risk environments, and they cost, each step is 8 units. It costs 16 units to get 2 steps, and that could be a very low permeable landscape. Could be a town centre, for example, lots of cats that want to eat those birds. Whereas the right-hand picture is of species which has managed to avoid the high risk landscape, the low permeability. It's gone through a high permeability landscape. It's had to travel further, but it's managed to travel further too. And it's a least cost path approach. And so when we're looking at the landscape and rebuilding the landscape, we have to recognize that we need to think about this in terms of what species do, because they tend to follow, lots of species follow this least cost path approach. So look at it here, okay? You can see, for some species, water will be a high cost environment. For watery species, that grassland will be a high cost environment. So how do they get from one patch to another? And that's what we need to think about when we're thinking about a nature recovery network. If we're thinking about species moving through the landscape, what is the cost to them of doing so? Because they're not going to go in a straight line unless they take the wind or flight, or they don't care. And that's the sort of ecological thinking that's really taxing us. So we can then add this permeability. I realize I'm kind of running out of time, I'm afraid. We then need to add what we call permeability. So how easy is it for species to get through this landscape? And we can put a measure on that. So I'm not going to go through the detail here, but if you're a woodland species, obviously a scrubby landscape is fully permeable to you. A hedgerow landscape is fully permeable to you, but roads and buildings probably aren't. Water is probably not. And that's really, really important. So, and I'll show you why that's important in a moment also. But we need to look at the landscape from the perspective of what habitat does this species prefer to live in. When we start to look at that in detail, we can begin to work out how permeable the landscape is. So how likely is it a dormouse can move from one woodland patch to another? How likely is it that a great crested newt can move from one pond to another? As they do, we need, great crested newts have what we call metapopulations. They live in patches and they're all interconnected. So those ponds all need to be connected for the health of the population of great crested newts. They don't just live in one pond. And so we need to look at the landscape in this kind of way. And this is a map of northwest Somerset, Avon, Bristol, okay? And this is a map of permeability. And I know it's very difficult to pick out, but the really important thing is look at the black, okay? Black is low permeable. White is fully permeable, and that gives you an indication of how little permeability there is in that landscape for these particular species. And that's the really important message I want to put in front of you. We so often we talk about a green and pleasant land. It's green, it's pleasant, but for a lot of species, it's not particularly permeable. Those species can't move from patch to patch, and we need to undo that. We can only know that if we start modeling it in this kind of way, so we get a knowledge of where these, you can see some corridors there, can't you, which are actually river corridors that give us that opportunity. I'm going to skim over this one, but there's a really important point here about patches need to be big. Remember I said hen harriers at Charnwood, 1,500 hectares, of heathland is kind of the minimum area for a pair of hen harriers. So we need big patches, not the very, very small patches that we currently have for lots of these habitats. What we call a minimum dynamic area. Small grasslands can be small, but these bigger habitats like woodlands, chalk downland, they need to be big. So we need to get some really big patches in our landscape. And I'll show you why that's important very quickly in a minute. Well, actually, I'm going to show you now. Okay, this is a distribution map of most of the woodlands in Leicestershire and Rutland. And okay, so there's no sense of scale there, but you can see there are not many big patches of congregations of woodland. Lots and lots of tiny woodlands. Woodlands which are less than 2 hectares. Okay, remember what I showed you on the previous picture? The woodlands need to be at least 50 hectares. Lots of these woodlands are less than 2. Then I'll show you the grasslands. Okay, same sort of picture. Lots of aggregations of grasslands and lots of areas with tiny, tiny grasslands. We've got a lot of work to do to map out where we can reconnect and make these grasslands, you know, bigger, better, more connected. And we're on this journey now. We're beginning to map them out and to identify the permeability and all that sort of stuff. So these are the results. So only a few more slides, okay, of our initial work, just to give you an idea. Okay, so we did some GIS analysis of the habitat patches in Leicestershire in particular. Okay, and what we found, this is a frequency distribution of the sizes of those patches, and admittedly it's fraught with some problems, but what it tells us is that 80% of the woodland area is between 1 square metre and 2 hectares. 80%. Okay, that's a significant challenge. There aren't many patches which are huge. Okay, in the grand scheme of all of the patches in Leicestershire. In terms of the shape of the patch, most of the habitats are linear or squished, not square. Why is that important? It's important because there's a difference between species which live in the edge and species which live in the middle, the core. Specialist species live in the core, generally, of a habitat. Generalist species generally live in the edge. And most of our habitats are not circular or square. They're squished in some way, shape or form. So that means lots of core species, the specialists, can't live in that landscape until we make them square or circular. Okay, that's a real problem in this landscape of Leicestershire and Rutland. And then lots of them are a long way away. Okay, most nearest neighbours are more than 100 metres away, even more than 1 kilometre away. Okay, so what you've got there on the scale is 10 metres, 100 metres, 1 kilometre, 10,000 metres. Okay, lots of habitat patches are a long way from their nearest large habitat patch, which means a lot of species can't make it. And that's a real problem in terms of the local nature recovery network, which we need to undo. And that's really important information that we've been working on. So hopefully that gives you an idea, you know, of where we are. And what we need to do is then to use that permeability thinking to then look at the maps and identify and work with the landowners to work out how we can make these sites bigger, better connected. And that's what we'll be doing over the next few years. We've yet to create these maps. That'll happen over the next 18 months or so, 2 years. And obviously working with the landowners and with other agencies and all that sort of thing to work out where these can go. And obviously this, you can see, this is where the farmers and the house builders come in, because they'll want to know where they can build their houses. They'll want to know where they can grow their crops of wheat or oilseed rape or pigs or cattle, and where we can create space for these grasslands and these woodlands. And here's a possible example of what a nature recovery network map might look like. So this is Birmingham Black Country. You can see the black are the core areas. The green are what we call enhancement areas. So these are areas with kind of new habitats to be created or better managed. And then you can see that the kind of lilac is the connectivity. So where do we need to enhance the connectivity for things like butterflies to move across the landscape, for hares or deer or whatever it is? You know, we need to identify these priority areas for connectivity. And we're just on the stages of, you know, we're embarking on that in Leicestershire and Rutland. And if you know people who have land, you know, who are interested in this, who have, you know, kind of an idea that they want to leave a legacy in some way, shape, or form, and that legacy is engaging in this nature recovery network, then let's hear about them. Let's get engaged with them to see how we can create, a string of roadside verges, hedgerows, all that sort of stuff to create this nature recovery network. Now, you're probably familiar that we've already got some of this in terms of our Living Landscapes project. And hopefully you saw from the previous maps that what we've already got in terms of our Living Landscapes project is already partly there. So Alan, I'll come to the question in a moment. What we've identified is that the Charnwood forest landscape of woodland and heathland is a really, really, kind of acid grassland is a really, really important one. And, the Sorenreek Valley is a really important opportunity corridor. The Jurassic limestone grasslands, really, really different landscape. And we need to work very closely on reconnecting the grassland landscape. Remember, tiny patches in the Jurassic limestone landscape. Liefield Forest, a big hunting forest, which we need to reconnect as a woodland area. And Nicola's just identified golf courses, and one of the things that we're looking to do is we've got, I think it's something like 13 golf courses who are warm to the idea of being sort of stepping stones within this landscape. And Alan was saying, has any country, or possibly already shown that this strategy is sufficient to ensure successful nature recovery? Yes, they have. And there's lots of work that we're building on there, both in terms of countries. So Estonia is one. Across Europe, there's a trans-European ecological network. A lot of work done in Holland, especially to show how this works. And it's been working on, kind of in some of the countries too. So, we've already got the basis. We just need to delve into the detail to make it work. So for us, it's earlier stages. So how are we going to make it work? As I've mentioned, kind of working with the planning authority and working with the landowners to create this landscape of more, bigger, better, connected. But mindful that you guys are part of a lit and fill society, I wanted to put something much more important to you, as well as the ecology. And that is, how do we make this work for people, and how do we make people work for it? And I really would welcome the opportunity to come back to talk to you about the ethical dimensions. That actually, are we consequentialists? Do we drive our thinking about the consequences of our actions, and the choices are driven by that? So it could be, your choice is to improve your financial situation, or it could be that actually we want to make the world a better place for species. Are we deontologists? Do we do things because it's the right thing to do? That we have a moral imperative. The moral imperative is to save species, for example, a moral imperative. What is it that drives us? And this is actually, Denise is asking this question, why are we so far behind? It's partly because of this ethical perspective. Over the last 20 or 30 years, we've been very consequentialist. We've been driven by a market economy, haven't we? It's been about finance and profit and all that sort of stuff. And we've lost sight of our simple ethical framework in many respects. We've lost sight of our virtue framework. And our virtue framework is a question of how virtuous are we? The right thing as a person. Do we do the right thing for our species that exists within this landscape? Do we do the right thing for the future of our offspring, for our colleagues, all that sort of stuff? How do we get from where we are as a consequentialist nation to one which is a virtuous one? And I want to put in front of you this concept of telos. And if I've got more time another time, I'd love to talk to you about telos if you're not familiar with it, because to me, telos is the fundamental answer here to helping establish a nature recovery network. Because I think it was Aristotle who came up with the concept of telos, and it's well worth revisiting the Greek philosophers, I think. Anyway, that's enough for that. That's kind of a taster of the whole thing, really. It's a race through. If you're interested in the ecological detail, there's a journal article here I recommend you have a look at, delivering resilient ecological networks as a particular aspect. I'd also encourage you, again, to answer Denise's question, You may have come across the Dasgupta review, which came out a couple of weeks ago, which was commissioned by the Treasury. So Professor Dasgupta wrote a report on the economics of biodiversity, just like Lord Stern did with the economics of climate change. And it's a game changer. It is truly a game changer. And I encourage you to have a look at the Dasgupta review, because for me, it's kind of the future that we have. So I'll leave you with the last part, really. In all of this, I've talked a lot about ecology, but I want you to remember that actually to be part of a nature recovery network, every little helps. Your window boxes, your gardens, the industrial estates, the woods, the trees, the quarries, the hedges, the field margins. If we actually work together, if we work and understand that actually these are species that share the planet with us, as Craig started with, that they are participants in our decisions, that they are passengers on a rock which is hurtling through space. If only we actually recognize that they have a right to be where they are in existence, and we created space for them, and then we'd have a much happier future for us and for them. Anyway, there we go. I realize that was a rush. I hope that kept you engaged, and I hope it gave you an indication, actually there's a bright future ahead of us, and we're all part of it, and we can all be a part of it too. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. I'll pass over to Bridget. Meanwhile, do you think you could stop sharing your screen for a bit?
I can, yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Right. Bridget, I think you should be unmuted now.
Yep. Well, thank you very much, John. The complexity of the challenge that you put in front of us was enormous, but you did end on a positive note and with great determinations, which is encouraging. So now we can move on to questions, which you were managing to answer some as we went along. But John Fothergill and I will try and spot some questions for you if people could either use the hand symbol or wave their arms around. We'll have a look who we've got.
I know John Tinning's had his hand up for some time. I don't know if that's intentional or not.
Was that so? Is that John?
So, maybe an accident. Well, John Holloway's got a question.
John Holloway, yes, John Holloway. John, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, that's my fault, John. Just a minute, I'll, sorry. I've got
it's
too many
technology.
I've got too many screens open, sorry. Right. You should be able to unmute yourself now. Yes.
You were very optimistic for the future. I have to say I'm much more pessimistic, thinking on timescales and the number of species we're losing per day worldwide. And this business of creating landscapes with corridors is clearly taking a lot of time. If I think of my young days, if you took a car out in the evening, which was a rare occurrence in those days, not many people had cars, but you come back home with moths and insects of every description on your windscreen. In fact, the windscreen would practically be impossible to see through for so many. You can drive around the county now and you will not get anything onto your windscreen. So making up that that degree of population of our countryside by all kinds of animals, including insects, seems to me to be an almost impossible task. And I think we've got very little time to do it in. We're getting to a really I mean, you sounded optimistic. Can we make it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yes, I am optimistic. but we have to be realistic. I think that's the really important point you're making. You know, we have lost significant numbers. We have lost species. We will lose species. One of the real challenges is to make people aware, actually, that we are in a crisis without creating a crisis culture. And as you say, as Craig said last week, and I used to teach the students, we've only got 10 years to change the direction. Yeah. The fact is that actually, you know, if we look at some of the successes, let's take red kite as an example. If we look at the cheetah as an example, the numbers of cheetahs on this planet were well, there's a suggestion that they were down to fewer than 10 at one point. Now, if we can have a species like the cheetah in numbers now, from such a low point, then, you know, that gives us hope that we can get other species back from their nadir. You know, let's have a look at the red kite as an example, you know, kind of maybe 20 or 30 pairs at most in Wales up until, you know, kind of 1960s. And now how many hundreds of pairs are there in the United Kingdom? Now, I know that's a step by step and it's one or two examples. The large blue, you know, extinct in the early 1970s, is extinct now in numbers in some of the sites, much greater than they ever were. Green Down, which is the site which I was involved with, is the most popular site for large blue, as an example. So we can do it. You know, it's going to be a challenge, of course, but part of my enthusiasm is to give people hope. You know, if we don't have hope, then what's the point?
Well, we've got to have action as well.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, there is action. There is loads of action. You know, and there's not enough. There's clearly not enough. You know, the biggest challenge is with government. And, you know, that's not necessarily because government is intransigent. It's because government is partly led by what they perceive, you know, their kind of peers and what the population perceives to be important. And, you know, we need a groundswell. You know, there's a question here about what can we do? So Mike was saying, how can we get involved in making all this happen? Number one is just make sure everybody that you know thinks that it's important. Because the more people say that actually, you know what, I want a garden that's full of wildlife, or I want to see song thrushes or whatever, the more people who go back to government and say, this is what I want, the more government will have no choice but to listen. If all people go back and say is what I want is, you know, penny in the pocket and cheap chicken, well, of course, that's what the government is going to deliver. Well,
some of the work that's been done by the RSPB in Hope Farm, for example, offers us hope just by putting big borders on fields. I wonder sometimes about driving around Rutland. There are many, many, many hedges. They run for miles and miles in all kinds of different directions. If you could persuade the people that look after the roads to leave a verge for wildlife, and you could persuade the guy on the other side of the hedge to do it as well, that would certainly help with your plan, wouldn't it?
Yes, absolutely would. And just in detail, I've had a meeting with a major landowner, and we're talking major landowner in the east of the county, who is interested in doing just that. Okay, and I put him in touch. I had a discussion with the highways department. So just that very simple thing about getting connection between the management of the verges on the roadside and this landowner, you know, kind of adding the bit on their side as an example. And I touched on the golf courses as another example. And just last week I had a long discussion with the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, who are creating farm clusters. And we talked about just that very thing, about identifying some farm clusters, connecting our nature reserves in instance. So let's identify all the farmers between a series of nature reserves and go out to them and say, look, you know, there's economic benefit in you having a wider field margin because you get extra pollinators, natural pest control. It reduces the necessary inputs in terms of pesticides and herbicides. You know, so your quid's in, the environment is quid's in. So, you know, we're pushing on all sorts of different fronts.
Thanks very much indeed.
No problem.
Other further questions?
Yeah, can I, John Tinning, I've had my hand up for a long time. Is it possible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I can't help thinking that there's an elephant in the room that you have not put your finger upon.
Okay.
And the elephant in the room is population. And until we get a grip on the numbers of people and the growth of population in this country, the pressures upon all these theoretical improvements are going to be so immense that we'll be overwhelmed. We have to have a national debate about what sort of size of population we feel this small island can support, and then to discuss how we might ethically move in the direction. And the second point I wanted to make to you was, I have grave misgivings about government's role in this. They have systematically starved Natural England and all the conservation bodies of finance over the last 25 years. And as to putting planning authorities in charge of this, I would have thought they were the last people we need to be involved. Planning authorities like planning things, and they tend to be houses and new roads.
Yep, no, thank you, John. Some really challenging questions there. Just very quickly, I take your points about population. Actually, I don't look at that in the same way. To me, I look at it, I look at the population problem as simply more about what we do as individuals rather than the actual population. So, you know, obviously, the island could not cope with 80 million people all living to the degree that we live at the moment. In point of fact, I'd encourage you, I mean, I don't know whether you're familiar with the the footprint, ecological footprint as a concept. If you're not, I'd encourage everybody to just type in ecological footprint and Earth Footprint Day and get an idea of just the challenge that we have in terms of the resources that we as individuals use. So to me, it's more about the resources that we use rather than the population numbers. And if you read the Dasgupta review, you'll get a feeling for that too. It's important, but actually we individually need to reduce our footprint, our environmental footprint, by about 80%, period, because the planet can't cope with it. So there's an aspect there, and there's some really interesting nuances within that. So yeah, you know, it really is about disturbance and impact. In terms of the government and planning authorities, well, yes, this is where the politics of stakeholders and networks and partnerships comes in. Yeah, you know, the point here is that planning authorities, the suggestion is that the planning authorities should have the responsibility, partly because if they don't, then they will forever do what they've always been able to do, which is to kind of consider it to be somebody else's problem. And so the idea here is that if you make it their problem, then they can't ignore it, that they have to make it happen. And they will be held accountable for not making it happen. And equally, they have the tools to make it happen through planning control and all that strategic development and all that stuff. So there's a two winning coin there in terms of the local authorities being the leaders. You know, and as you say, in terms of the government, you know, there's been a real problem about the way in which they have sequentially both neutered and failed to finance the statutory environment agencies. And, you know, there are political reasons for that. And, you know, a lot of those politics are based around, you know, simply not being given the impression that the environment is important. I really do believe that, you know, we have to make them realise that the environment is important, and there's a lot of hope, you know, with the likes of Zach Goldsmith as being part of the government's advisor, and with Boris Johnson's partner, Carrie Symonds. You know, I don't know how many of you listened to her talk at the Bird Fair last year, the year before last. You know, she's a very smart cookie, and you know, very passionate about the environment. So you know, I still concerns, but the proof will be, you know, kind of in the pudding of what we see in the next 9 months in terms of the international conferences that this government will be hosting. But John, yeah, John, they are really important questions. Absolutely nothing that is not right there.
I don't know if I can see further questions. Yes, Aftab. Aftab, can you unmute yourself, please?
As elephants were mentioned, I just wondered how these ideas might be applied on a bigger scale in Africa, for example. But in the time that I've been working there, I've seen the population grow by something like a factor of 8, and animals' populations are shrinking. And I don't know whether these sorts of ideas, you know, the areas that animals can roam in is getting smaller, as towns grow. Are they being applied on in other parts of the world on a bigger scale?
Absolutely, yep. So elephants is a really important one because, of course, you've got rainforest elephants and savanna elephants and different, populations which are isolated. And certainly in terms of elephants, there are some projects to identify these kind of the bigger corridors and the bigger areas where consideration for the elephants and their requirements is paramount. So the International Union for the Conservation of Nature have got kind of specialist species groups that are looking at that, and vultures is another example. So kind of the rapid decline of these birds, which roam huge distances, particularly in places like Namibia, is a major consideration. So there are projects going around which are looking at kind of making people, more than anything, making people aware of the impacts of their day-to-day choices, such as putting out pesticides, to get rid of jackals and things like that, and the impact that has had on vultures. So yes, there are some projects at landscape scale, particularly for those and other species. And I know that because I've been sitting alongside people doing that research up at Brackenhurst and Nottingham Trent University for the last 12 years. Things like vultures and cheetahs and elephants. The challenge obviously comes with kind of improving lifestyles and how we enable people to have a fair and equitable life, particularly in the developing countries, and that in a bigger sense is a really, really big challenge, certainly.
Thank you. So to give our vote of thanks to John, I'd like to call on the Natural History section's representative on council, that's Hazel Graves.
Hello. Yes, it's with great pleasure that I'm giving this vote of thanks to John this evening. I hadn't expected to do this, as I have given the vote of thanks on the last two meetings like this. However, I've been asked to step in due to illness, which brings me to the reason that John is here tonight. We were to have a talk on farmland birds, but that had to be postponed again for personal reasons and will take place in the joint meeting slot in March 2022. I am so grateful to John for being prepared to step in and do this exciting lecture with only a few weeks' notice. Many of you will have heard Craig Bennett's excellent Peach lecture last Monday, highlighting the environmental crisis facing us and detailing some of the ways an impending catastrophe can be avoided. This is well worth catching up with on YouTube if you missed it. And tonight, John has enlarged on this topic and explained how we can make plans, local plans, to help the situation. John has got so many ideas. Some of them are familiar to us, but obviously not all. And it's absolutely fabulous to see it all pulled together. The whole evening has been so thought-provoking. So many of us are aware of environmental problems, but the constant refrain amongst my friends and acquaintances is, but what can I do that matters? Does it really make a difference if I turn my heating down by 1 degree, if other millions don't? Or if I reduce my plastic use, meat intake, etc., if others don't? I know I struggle with this myself. By people joining together, we can make a difference, especially by becoming better informed. National schemes can lead the way. Individuals can make their voices heard by signing petitions, lobbying their MPs. And many of us can become involved and make a difference at a local level. As I have said on previous occasions, many of the members of the Lit and Phil Natural History section are also members of the local Wildlife Trust and other voluntary wildlife associations, bird societies, butterfly societies, etc., and actively volunteer with management of their reserves. Our members are also highly active in most of the various recording schemes, providing data which can be used to make informed decisions about these recovery programmes. We want to help as much as we can. Many of us have found the period of the COVID pandemic deeply disturbing. However, because of the restrictions on travel Many of us have spent longer exploring our local areas and discovered the joy that is to be found in the Leicestershire and Rutland countryside. I commend John and his team at Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust for the efforts they are making to improve the quality of the natural environment in Leicestershire and Rutland. Many and very sincere thanks to you, John, for your lecture tonight and the effort your team is making into improving our environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I shall take that back to the team. They'll love it.
Thank you.
Good, yes, and thank you, John. And so now, and thank you, Hazel. Good night to everyone, and I hope to see you all again in 2 weeks' time for the inaugural lecture